I have worked night shift at St. Carmine's for 11 years. I have seen people die. I have seen people survive things that should have killed them. I have sat with people in their last hours and held their hands and said things that I hoped meant something and sometimes did and sometimes did not. After 11 years, you develop a relationship with death that is not comfortable exactly, but is functional. You learn to carry it, to set it down at the end of the shift, to pick it up again the next night without being destroyed by the accumulated weight of it. What happened in room 412 is not something I have been able to set down. I want to be precise about what kind of person I am before I describe what happened, because what I am about to describe is the kind of thing that gets attributed to exhaustion or stress, or the particular psychological weight of working in a place where people regularly die. I want you to understand that I had worked 11 years of night shifts without experiencing anything I could not explain. I had never seen anything. I had never heard anything. I was not the kind of nurse who spoke about the ward being haunted or who avoided certain rooms or who attributed the deaths that came in clusters to anything other than statistical noise. I was not that kind of person. I am still not that kind of person. What I am is a person who cannot explain what I saw in room 412 on the night of March 4th. Room 412 is at the end of the east corridor, third door from the fire exit. It is a single occupancy room, which means it is used for patients who need isolation, infection risk, or patients who are actively dying and whose families have requested privacy. On the night of March 4th, it was occupied by a man I will call Mr. Harlan, 78 years old, end-stage cardiac failure, DNR on file, expected to die within 72 hours according to the attending physician. He had no family on record. He had been on the ward. I had cared for him every night of those 9 days. Mr. Harlan was unconscious by the time my shift started. Not sedated, his body had simply gone to the place that bodies go in the final hours, a deep unresponsiveness that is distinct from sleep, that has a specific quality you learn to recognize after you have seen it enough times. He was breathing shallow, irregular, the particular breathing pattern called Cheyne-Stokes that indicates the brain is no longer properly rigged. His vitals were consistent with a man who had hours, not days. I checked him at the start of shift at midnight and at 2 a.m. Each time the same, unconscious Cheyne-Stokes vitals declining incrementally. At 3:47 a.m. I was at the nursing station doing documentation when the call light for room 412 came on. I want to be very clear about this. The call light is activated by a button on the bed rail, accessible to the patient. Mr. He had not been conscious since at least 9 p.m., 4 hours before my shift started, according to the evening nurse's notes. He could not have pressed the button. The call light was on. I walked to room 412. I pushed open the door. Mr. Harlan was lying exactly as I had left him at 2 a.m., unchanged, unconscious, unresponsive, Cheyne-Stokes breathing. The room was dim, the overhead was off, and the nightlight above the bed cast a low amber glow. The call light button on the bed rail had not been pressed. It was not physically depressed, which meant the light had not been activated by contact with the button. I checked the equipment. No malfunction I could identify. I reset the call light system from the room panel. I did my check, vitals, respiration. I noted that his breathing had changed, slightly longer pauses between breaths, which indicated progression. I made a note in the chart and turned to leave. He spoke. Not with the volume of someone who is conscious and trying to communicate. More like the sound a person makes when they are talking in their sleep. Low, without inflection, the words produced without apparent effort or intent. But they were words, clear words. I heard them distinctly in the quiet of the room. He said, "She's been here all night." I turned around. He was exactly as before, eyes closed, completely still except for the shallow, irregular rise and fall of his chest. Lips slightly parted the way they are in deep unconsciousness. Everything consistent with a man in the final stage of dying. Nothing consistent with a man who had just spoken. I stood in the room for a long moment. I looked at him. I looked at the room. I looked at the chair in the corner, which was the chair I had been using during my checks, the chair where, on the previous nights, I had sometimes sat for a few minutes during the quieter parts of the shift to be present with him in the way I tried to be present with patients who were dying alone. The chair was empty. I sat back down in it. I said quietly, "Mr. Harlan, it's the nurse. You're at the hospital. You're okay." He did not respond. I sat in the chair for 10 minutes. The room was very quiet. His breathing continued, longer and longer gaps between breaths now, the spaces where his body was practicing the stillness it was about to commit to permanently. Outside in the corridor, I could hear the distant sounds of the ward. Inside room 412, there was nothing except the man in the bed and me in the chair and the amber nightlight and the silence between his breaths. At 3:59 a.m., his breathing stopped. I noted the time. I did what? I called the attending. I completed the documentation. I did all of it with the professional efficiency that 11 years produces, the movements automatic and practiced, which was fortunate because a part of my mind was occupied with something else entirely. It was occupied with what he had said. "She's been here all night." I thought about the call light that had activated without being pressed. I thought about sitting in that chair on previous nights, being present for a man who was. I thought about the word she, about all night. I did not go back to room 412 for the remainder of the shift. I told myself this was because there was nothing to go back for. I knew with a certainty I could not account for that it was something else. 3 weeks later, I was assigned room 412 again, a new patient, a woman in her 60s recovering from surgery. Routine. I went in at the start of shift to introduce myself and do the initial assessment. When I walked in, she was sitting up in bed and she looked at me, and before I could speak, she said, "There was a woman in here last night, standing at the window. I thought she was a nurse, but she didn't come to the bed." I asked her what the woman looked like. She said she couldn't see her clearly. She said she was just standing at the window, not moving, looking out. She said she was there for a long time and then she wasn't there anymore. I noted it in the chart as possible post-anesthesia disorientation and completed the assessment. I did not look at the window. I have not looked at the window of room 412 since that night. Not because I am afraid of what I would see, because I am afraid of what I would not see and what that absence would mean and what it would require me to believe about the presence that Mr. Harlan, from somewhere very close to death, had tried to tell me about. "She's been here all night." I believe him. I don't know what to do with that. I want to tell you about the patient in bed 7, and I want to tell you about him carefully, because the horror of what happened is not in any single incident. It is in the accumulation, the slow building of something that I kept finding reasonable explanations for until I ran out of reasonable explanations. And by that point, I was standing in a supply closet at 4 in the morning, unable to make myself go back onto the floor. The ward was a general medical unit, 32 beds, typical overnight census of 25 to 28 patients. I was the night charge nurse. I had been in that position for 4 years. I knew the ward the way you know a place you have spent thousands of hours. The sounds it made, the way the light fell at different times of night, the particular rhythms of its population, the difference between the quiet of a ward where everyone is sleeping and the quiet of a ward where something is wrong. Bed 7 was in the bay closest to the nursing station, a 4-bed bay, best observed location on the floor, which was why we tended to put patients there who needed close monitoring. The patient in bed 7 on the night I am describing was a 63-year-old man admitted for workup of new neurological symptoms, unsteady gait, visual disturbances, episodes of confusion. He had been admitted 2 days prior and the workup was ongoing. He was ambulatory, independent, not particularly ill-appearing. He was not on any medications that would cause altered mental status. He had spoken to me at the start of shift about the hockey game he had watched that afternoon and his opinion of the team's defensive strategy. He was, in every way I could assess, a coherent, oriented adult. At 2:15 a.m., I was reviewing labs at the nursing station when the tech who had been doing vitals rounds came back and said there was something strange with the patient in bed 7. I asked what she meant. She said he was awake and sitting up and had asked her, Who the other man was, I asked. What other man? She said he had been pointing at the empty chair beside his bed and asking who the man sitting in it was. And when she had told him no one was sitting there, he had looked at her with an expression she described as not confused. She was specific about this. She said he did not seem confused. He seemed certain, and had said that the man had been sitting there for a long time and was just sitting there watching him, and he wanted to know who it was. I went to bed 7. The patient was sitting up in bed, oriented, vital signs normal. The chair beside his bed was empty. I sat down across from him and I asked him calmly about what he had described to the tech. He told me precisely and without agitation that a man had been sitting in the chair beside his bed for approximately the past 2 hours. He described the man, average build, older, sitting very still, not speaking, not moving, simply sitting in the chair watching him. He said the man had not done anything threatening. He said the man had just been there. He said he had assumed initially that it was another patient who had wandered in by mistake. But the man never moved and never responded to any attempt at communication, and he had eventually concluded that the man was not a patient and had not come in by mistake. I told him calmly that I would look into it. I did a full neuro check, oriented to person, place, time, and situation, followed complex commands, no focal deficits, nothing to suggest acute change. I documented the episode as a possible visual hallucination in the context of his admitting diagnosis and increased his monitoring frequency. I believed this. It was the correct clinical interpretation given the information I had. At 3:30 a.m., the patient in bed 8, the bed directly adjacent to bed 7, separated by a curtain, pressed her call light. When I came in, she said she was having trouble sleeping. I asked why. She said it was because of the man in the chair. I said there was no one in the chair. She looked at me. She said she could see the chair from her bed through the gap in the curtain, and there had been a man sitting in it since at least 2 a.m. She said she had assumed he was a visitor who had fallen asleep. She said she had not said anything because it was not her business. I asked her to describe what she had seen. She described the same figure the patient in bed 7 had described. Older man, sitting very still, not moving, not speaking. I drew the curtain back. The chair was empty. I stood there for a moment with the curtain in my hand and looked at the empty chair. 2 patients, separated by a curtain, had independently described the same figure sitting in that chair. Neither of them had spoken to each other. I had been monitoring the bay all night. The patient in bed 8 had specifically described watching the figure through the gap in the curtain, which meant she had not heard the patient in bed 7 describing it before she made her report. I checked the ward. I checked every room, every chair. I checked the stairwells and the supply rooms. I documented everything as required. At 4:40 a.m., 40 minutes before shift change, I was at the nursing station writing up the incident reports when I became aware that I could see bed 7's bay from where I was sitting. It was a clear sight line. The nursing station was positioned specifically to allow observation of the bays. The chair beside bed 7 was occupied. I could not see details from that distance. I could see that the chair, which had been empty when I checked it 20 minutes ago, now appeared to have someone in it, a shape, a stillness that was different from the stillness of empty furniture. I stood up. I walked to the bay. The chair was empty. The patient in bed 7 was asleep. I went back to the nursing station. I finished the incident reports. I handed off to the day charge nurse at 6 a.m. without mentioning what I had seen from the nursing station, because I had no framework for documenting it, and because the day nurse had a full patient load, and there was nothing actionable in what I had to say. I have thought about the patient in bed 7 many times since that night. I have thought about the 2 independent reports, the described consistency of the figure, the fact that neither patient had any history of psychiatric illness or hallucinatory episodes prior to that night. I have thought about what I saw from the nursing station, or what I thought I saw, which is the formulation I have been using because it is the only one that keeps me functional. The patient in bed 7 was discharged 4 days after that night. His neurological workup. No cause for his symptoms was ever found. He was discharged with a referral for outpatient follow-up that was essentially a way of saying we don't know what this was and we hope it doesn't come back. I never told him about the patient in bed 8. I think about whether he ever sat in a chair again with the feeling of being watched. I think he probably did. Every hospital ward has a whiteboard. Ours was at the end of the corridor, visible from the nursing station, updated at the start of each shift with patient names, room numbers, assigned nurses, and any relevant notes. Standard practice. Functional, unremarkable, the kind of object you look at 50 times a night without actually seeing it. I started looking at it differently after the night of October 9th. I was the only RN on the overnight that shift, short-staffed, a situation that was more common than it should have been, with a float tech named Danny who was 19 years old and in his second month and was trying hard but was still learning the difference between urgency levels. It was not a good setup for a busy ward. It was the setup we had. The shift started normally. Census of 22 patients, most of them stable, 2 who needed watching more closely, a post-operative patient in room 6 with a blood pressure that had been trending in a direction I didn't like, and an elderly man in room 11 whose family had been called in the afternoon because his condition had been declining. By midnight, both were stable. The post-ops pressure had corrected with fluids. The man in room 11 was resting, unchanged from the evening. At 1:15 a.m., I was at the nursing station updating charts when I noticed the whiteboard. There was a name on it that I had not written. Our board listed 22 names in my handwriting. I had written them at the start of shift, room number, name, my initials beside each one. They were all still there, unchanged. But between room 11 and room 12, in handwriting that was not mine, was a name. Just a name, no room number, no initials, no notes. Written in blue marker, which was what we used for the board, but in a script I did not recognize, neat and deliberate, as if someone had stood at the board and written it carefully. The name was not the name of any patient on the ward. I stood at the nursing station and I looked at the board for a long time. Danny was doing vitals rounds and was not in my line of sight. I thought about who had access to the board. Staff only, it was behind the nursing station, not accessible to patients or visitors. Housekeeping had come through at 11 p.m. and had not gone near the board. I had been at the nursing station or in patient rooms continuously since then. I had not left the board unattended for more than the few minutes it took to check a patient. I wrote down the name in my pocket notebook. I erased it from the board. I went back to my documentation and I told myself it was a mistake, a name from a previous shift that had not been properly erased and that I had somehow not noticed during my initial board check, which was implausible but was the only explanation available to me. At 2:40 a.m., the patient in room 11 died. Expected death, natural progression, family present. I did everything correctly. I was with him at the end and the family was present, and it was, as these things can be, as decent as a death can be. I completed the documentation. I made the calls. I handled the body and the paperwork with the efficiency that the situation required. At 3:15 a.m., when everything was done and I had a moment to stand at the nursing station and breathe, I looked at the board. Beside the now empty room 11 slot, in the same handwriting as before, the neat, deliberate script that was not mine, there was a single word. The word was found. I stood very still. Danny came around the corner from his vitals rounds and saw my face and asked if I was okay. I said yes. I asked him if he had written anything on the board tonight. He said no. I asked him if he had seen anyone near the board. He said no. He asked again if I was okay. I erased the word from the board. I went into the supply closet and I stood there for approximately 4 minutes with my back against the shelving, and I breathed, and I thought about the name that had appeared on the board between room 11 and room 12 at some point before 1:15 a.m., before the death, written in handwriting that was not mine and did not belong to anyone on staff that night. I thought about the word found. I have since asked every staff member who worked on that ward around that time if they had any knowledge of the name on the board. None of them did. I have researched the name. It is a real name, not a common one, not a name with any obvious connection to the ward or the hospital or any patient in our records. I have no explanation for how it got on the board. What I have is this. I know that in a hospital, people die. I know that dying is a process and not an event, and that the process involves things we understand and things we do not understand, and that 11 years of night shift has given me a very specific education in the difference between those two categories. I know that the category I do not understand is larger than I was taught to believe it was when I started this job. And I know that on the night of October 9th, something wrote a name on a whiteboard before a man died, and came back afterward to mark it finished. I have thought about what it means to be found. I have tried to decide whether found is a comfort or a threat. I have not been able to decide. I think about the man in room 11 sometimes. I think about his family being there, about the decency of the end he had. I think about whether found means what I hope it means, that there was something waiting, that he was received, that the dying was not an ending but a location, a place you arrive at after a long journey and someone is there when you get there. I think about this because it is the version I can live with. But I also think about the name on the board written before the death, not after, and I think about whatever wrote it, standing at the whiteboard in the quiet of a night shift, writing a name in neat, deliberate script, already knowing who was coming, already knowing they would be found. I don't know if that is a comfort. Some nights I think it is. Some nights when the ward is very quiet and the overhead lights are low and there are 20-something people sleeping in the rooms around me, each of them carrying whatever it is they carry into sleep. I stand at the nursing station and I look at the whiteboard and I think about what might be written there that I cannot see. And I check the board very carefully. Every single night. I check it very carefully.